So I want to welcome everyone today. This event is co-sponsored by the Institute of International Studies and the Institute of Governmental Studies, and also the International and Area Studies course on U.S. foreign policy after 9/11. We'll have a Q&A after the talk, and we're here to celebrate Walter Russell Mead's new book, which is on sale in the back after the show, and which I heartily recommend. I've read it and just interviewed him, and I'm pleased to say that it's going to sit on the shelf next to Special Providence, which was his book on U.S. foreign policy, which is a classic in the field and which should be read by everybody who's interested in U.S. foreign policy, students and the public. Walter Russell Mead is the Henry A. Kissinger Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and one of the country's leading students of U.S. foreign policy. His new book, God and Gold, Britain, America, and the Making of the Modern World, is an analysis of who we are and why we got the way we are, and what that tells us about the way the world responds to us, and its purpose, I think, is to sharpen our understanding of ourselves and that inter-civilizational dialogue. We have cards which are being distributed, and we will collect them after Walter finishes his talk, and then we'll use them as a basis for the discussion that follows. Please, they're small cards, no speeches on the cards, just a question. Otherwise, it'll be lost in the flow of questions that come up. So it's a great privilege to welcome Walter Russell Mead, the Henry A. Kissinger Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, to Berkeley today. Walter.
Thank you. Well, maybe I should start by saying that although I am the Kissinger Fellow, I am neither Henry Kissinger, nor do I speak in his name. In fact, when I got this appointment, he invited me to lunch, and he said, "Listen, Walter," he says, "we're going to have an agreement." I said, "Really? Okay. What is it?" And he said, "You won't be responsible for anything I say or do, and I won't be responsible for anything you say or do." And every time I've seen him since, he tells me how glad he is we have that agreement. So what you're hearing is not the official view of the council. It's not the official view of Dr. Kissinger. It's just me. My latest book, God and Gold, starts from a perception that I had. It is one of the ways I write books is I start to write a completely different book, and then I discover that I'm basically and fundamentally wrong about a subject of major importance. And then I sort of go try to figure out, why am I wrong? How did I get to be wrong? And what if what I think is so ain't so, what is true instead of what I believe? And the starting point for this book is that I'd been kind of brought up and taught to believe that the story of modern history, the last 400 years, is the rise and fall of Europe, or the rise and fall of the West. And as I began to look more carefully at that, one of the things I noticed was that after 1763, when the British had defeated the French in North America and India, from that time to this, there really hasn't been a European presence outside of Europe and maybe North Africa that was strategically independent of either the British or the Americans. That is, the British could have, whenever the British chose, they could gobble up anybody's colonies that they wanted to outside of Britain. And that really, if you then look a little deeper into it, you see that since 1688, the Glorious Revolution in Britain, either the British or the Americans or both has won every major great power conflict in which they've participated. Put it another way, the British have only lost one major great power war since 1688, and that was the American Revolution. which we won. And this is an extraordinary record. This does not include small wars or individual campaigns. They used to say in Britain, by the way, Britain loses every battle but the last. But it does mean that the wars that kind of create the international order from generation to generation have been won by the Anglo-Americans since the 17th century. It almost looks like a pattern. At the same time, it is true that for a very long time, the British and the Americans have misunderstood the meaning or the likely consequences of their victories. After the Napoleonic Wars, the British kind of thought that maybe the age of great wars were over and the triumph of liberal Whig principles was going to bring about a peaceful order. And you can read that Locksley Hall by Tennyson talks about, how the Parliament of Man is going to be created, the federation of the world, universal peace brought in by law and democracy. World War I, Woodrow Wilson talks about the war to end war, and how with the defeat of German militarism, we'll now put all that behind us. Right before the war, Norman Angell had written that, war was the great illusion, and that economic interdependence was making war impossible. 1929, when the economy looked great, Hitler was marginalized in Germany, the Soviets were liberalizing, and it looked to many people, as if yet again, Whig principles, Anglo-American principles of liberal capitalist democracy were winning. This must be the end of history, as we would have said today. And so you have the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which made war illegal forever. Thank God. You can only imagine what the last 80 years would have been like if we hadn't have gotten rid of war. And immediately after World War II, you get the same thing. The San Francisco Conference over the UN. You had all kinds of people comparing the UN Charter to the Magna Carta, the Declaration of Independence, the Gettysburg Address. And this was going to end war forever. And of course, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, yet again, we had the end of history. And we had the belief that now, finally, after all of these years and all of these struggles, it was all over and things were going to be okay. So we have been strong enough to win all the conflicts, but we've been consistently wrong about what the conflicts mean or what their end means for the future. It's interesting. How could we be so strong and be so wrong? How are these connected? And if we are wrong in this way, and if history doesn't end every time we beat the latest enemy, what is going on? And what, if anything, is the point of this Anglo-American power in the world? So that's sort of the book I've been looking at. That's the book I ended up trying to write. And if you look at this Anglo-American system, I call it in the book the maritime system or the maritime order of trade, of finance, of culture, of power, of ideology. This system was stronger and more deeply implanted in the world in 2000 than it was in 1900. It was stronger in 1900 than it was in 1800. It was stronger in 1800 than it was in 1700. It's not declining. It continues to insinuate itself ever deeply into the way the world works. Now that could change tomorrow, but it's vastly premature to speak of the decline of this system. As I looked into it a little more, I found that this system was actually not only not invented by the Americans, it was not invented by the British. It was invented by the Dutch. The operating software, you might say, on which the world runs, the operating system of the world, was version 1.0 was introduced by the Dutch in the early 17th century. The British introduced version 2.0 close to 1700. The Americans came in with version 3.0 sometime in the 1940s. And we put in a few upgrades along the way. And this system is what I've tried to understand. Where does it come from? How does it work? And as I've thought about it, it seems to me that there is actually some common elements of policy or of social structure that the Dutch, the British, and the Americans have all followed. The protocols of the Elders of Greenwich, if you want to say, the 5-point plan for global domination that the Anglo-Americans have been following for several hundred years. What is the plan? All right. Point 1, you have an open society at home. That is to say, and again, here the Dutch invented it. In the 17th century, the Dutch basically say, you can be Calvinist, you can be Lutheran, you can be Catholic, you can be Jewish, as long as you don't talk too loudly about it, you can have no religion at all. Come on in, make money, do what you want. And they came. University professors came like Descartes because you could say what you wanted in a Dutch university without getting ridden out of town on a rail or burned at the stake. Scientists came because, again, there was no inquisition. And peasants could become merchants. You didn't have to do what your parents did. And you could become very wealthy and successful, and that was okay. In fact, it was excellent. And financial markets took off. You have the world's first joint stock companies. You even had the world's first great speculative bubble, the tulip bubble in Holland. Many of the features of the internet of open liberal society that we see today are already there in 17th century Holland. What's the next thing that you do? You take the show on the road. That is to say, you've created this dynamic society. You have all these new products. You have systems of finance and capitalization that allow resources to be deployed more effectively than ever before. You have new products, you have new ideas, and you go out and you engage with the rest of the world. You buy, you sell, you make money. You try to convert the heathen. Every now and then you're influenced by what the heathen say back to you. There's interchange and admixture. And this makes you, among other things, very, very rich. It made the Dutch rich, it made the British rich, it made the Americans rich. And out of this wealth, you go to point 3 of the secret plan, which is to say, you pursue a geopolitical and military strategy that matches your global engagement. So you would be in those early days, and even to some extent we are today, a sea power, where you protect and control the chief lanes of commerce, sea commerce around the world. And you also pursue a balance of power strategy in Europe and more recently in other parts of the world, so that you have all those European countries are like, Austria and Prussia are fighting massive wars over who gets to have Silesia, which is a sort of roughly sausage-shaped province in what is now Poland. And while they fight these ruinous wars over Silesia, suspicious of each other and so on, you are based on establishing an international system. You are thinking globally while they are thinking regionally, and you have a balance of power strategy. You adopt an appropriate geopolitical strategy for each of the key regions of the world. Point 4 of your strategy, having built this global system of trade and commerce, and this is very devious, you then open it up to other people. So after World War II, the U.S. says to Germany and Japan, you're not going to be punished and discriminated against. Come on in, buy, sell, trade. If you guys make Volkswagens and Toyotas that outsell what General Motors and Ford are making, okay, do it. Knock yourselves out. So that what happens in peace is that other countries have less incentive to try to challenge the system. They kind of like the system. They're getting rich in the system. They see benefits to this world order. But meanwhile, their economies get involved in it. They grow, they develop these industries that depend on being able to import raw materials from all over the world and then find markets all over the world and link in with these financial networks. And so that's 4A. 4B is, if you then come to a war, come to a confrontation, you cut off their access to that global economy, to that global system. They don't have the raw materials. They don't have the markets. They don't have all those communications. And so the very thing that makes it less likely that they will go to war with you in peace makes it more likely that if, God forbid, there is a conflict, you will prevail. And the British did this, were doing this to the French in the 18th century in the Napoleonic Wars, and the Americans and the British did it to Germany and Japan in World War I and World War II. It's a very constant element of this strategy. And finally, point 5, and this may be the most evil and devious thing of all, you promote liberal institutions in the various countries with which you're dealing. You do it in a way that matches your other interests, but you try to encourage other countries, or even in some cases force other countries to develop institutions and policies that, first of all, make it easier for your companies and your investments to do well in those countries. So, for example, you want, if you're an American multinational corporation, you want there to be the rule of law and a legitimate, transparent system of justice in China, in Nigeria, in South Africa, in Turkey, and so on, because it makes it easier for you as an investor and as a business to make money. But at the same time, doing those things enables those societies to do better in this capitalist international system that you've established. And again, you want happy, satisfied customers. One source of a critique of the Anglo-American project is that it sort of depends on poverty in other countries. Actually, poverty in other countries is a problem for the system, not an opportunity. What you want is everyone to be sort of as bourgeois and boring and comfortable as possible. And the promotion of liberal policies abroad is one of the ways that you do that. Plus, it makes you feel good about yourself, and sometimes even makes other people feel, if not good about you, slightly less bad than they otherwise would feel. So that's the 5-point plan, and it's been working. And I think is going to continue to work for some time. The next question I suppose that comes to mind is, well, why is it that the Anglo-Americans were doing this and not other people? Why did we get to be the ones with the protocols of the elders of Greenwich? Why aren't these the protocols of the elders of Paris, the protocols of the elders of Berlin, or the protocols of the elders of Beijing? And I think some of this has to do with just geography and history. England in some ways was the Goldilocks country at the dawn of the early modern age, when capitalism was making a kind of a full-blown appearance in the world. It was not too big like Russia, and it was not too small like Holland. It was not too close to Europe like France or Germany, which gets themselves constantly involved in these wars. It has the channel to protect it, but it's not so far away that it's kind of out of the European mainstream. And then it had a Goldilocks Reformation. Not too hot like the Reformation in Germany that dissolves into 100 years of religious warfare in which a third of the population is killed, or not too cold as, say, in Italy, where the Counter-Reformation imposes orthodoxy and kills freedom of thought. But it was kind of just right. It doesn't go into chaos and war, but on the other hand, the Anglican establishment is never able to impose rigid conformity and drive out heresy and unorthodox thinking. So there are these matters. The geographical location on the coast was very good as the sort of center of world trade moves out of the Mediterranean and into the Atlantic and the broader seas and so on. All of these things contribute. But I think there is an additional set of cultural factors that one has to look at. Sort of the Anglo-American, the British certainly before us, but the Anglo-American cultures have been more comfortable with capitalism than many other countries have been. It's been an easier fit in certain ways. There's a wonderful Gilbert and Sullivan Patter song about a young attorney who finishes law school, and then he tries to get cases, but he's not making a living. He's starving because he can't make a living. And he says, I soon grew tired of third-class journeys and dinners of bread and water, so I fell in love with a rich attorney's elderly, ugly daughter. And that actually sort of describes the relationship that a lot of the world has with capitalism. Doesn't like capitalism, finds it repugnant, but it's a source of income, of wealth. And so what you try to do is you try to get as much of the money with as little contact with the daughter as possible. And so you see, for example, now in Germany, they introduced some labor market reforms in under the last government. Now the economy is doing a little bit better. Well, instead of saying, gee, a little reform made us a little richer, let's see whether more reform will make us richer still, they're saying, now that things are better, we don't need all those damned reforms. And we can go back and be more comfortable. So when you see that you're being overwhelmed and falling behind in this race for capitalism, the race for the future, your companies are falling behind, your economy is less efficient, then you'll sort of introduce some reforms and you'll hate it the whole time. But in the case of the French and the Germans, you usually do okay. The Anglo-Americans actually fell in love with her. That is to say, capitalism has struck many people in the Anglo-American world down through history, not as some unfortunate necessity that you have to deal with, but as a source of satisfaction. Even in a sense, a place where, the self-improvement, rationalization of industry, inventing new things, it's exciting, it's fulfilling, it's accomplishing something positive for the world and yourself. It's even where you sort of meet transcendence. So there's been a greater eagerness for it. There has also been, there's a kind of a cultural, Macaulay, the great Whig historian Thomas Babington Macaulay, was talking about why was Victorian England stronger and richer than other places? Why did it in particular beaten the French with such satisfying regularity? And he talked about the order, so the union of order and liberty as being the key to English success. And the way to understand this, I think, is to look at sports. Almost every sport that is played widely today is played under rules that were developed in 19th century Britain or America. Soccer, tennis, American football, baseball, cricket, Marquis of Queensberry rules for boxing, track and field, swimming. These things were all actually organized and given close to their modern form in 19th century Britain. And it's interesting, two passions or two ways of looking at the world that we often see separated came together. On the one hand, the love of competition. Let there be winners. Let's have an event where somebody can win the race and be the fastest swimmer or the best football player or whatever it may be. But on the other hand, rules and regulations. The new rules were much more extensive and far-reaching. So what they did was they had regulation in the service of competition. You didn't regulate these sports to make them less interesting or less dramatic or less competitive. You regulated them to make them more exciting, more fun, make the competition in a sense more legitimate and transparent. And furthermore, if you wanted to have competition between leagues of teams in different cities, something that didn't exist in the 18th century, again invented largely thanks to the railroad and the cheap press in 19th century Britain and copied in America and from there all over the world, you need a set of rules that work for the whole country and written down. And you need actually professional referees, professional enforcers who keep the rules regulated in a transparent and fair way, and so on and so forth. So this sporting culture that develops out of the Anglo-American cultural world has gone on to sweep the world as very few things in world history have ever done. So the entire world follows these various sports. And They become people who hate England and they play soccer in Iran, even though the hatred of Britain is one of the deepest unifying passions that binds all Iranians together, or most of them. But it's this combination, and I think that you can say the same thing about business and finance too, that regulation is not seen as a way to tamp the fires of capitalism down, but actually regulation is a sort of a trellis, a framework around which capitalism can grow, that can sustain ever more elaborate, ever more far-reaching, ever more dynamic forms of capitalist development. And every now and then we blow it, like with the subprime mortgage thing, but we then don't think, we've got to stop home lending. What we do is we try to then find a regulatory framework that can accommodate even more, can accommodate real exchange better. And I think we will probably continue to do that. So just as this form of Anglo-American sporting competition has become very prevalent, so has this business organization. Now, why do we think this way? Why do things that in much of the world seem to be incompatible, why have they been sort of fused in this rather odd way in the Anglo-American world? In particular, as I thought about this, I began to notice that there are a lot of... I looked obviously first at Adam Smith's idea of the invisible hand, and I tried to understand, how did he have this confidence that the unplanned workings and interactions of millions of people pursuing their own interests and their own activities would yield a kind of a self-managing, self-balancing, harmonious system? Well, I began to look at English intellectual and cultural history. One of the things I understood is that, first of all, you look at the English system of common law, that it's very much the same kind of a system. That is to say, English common law does not derive from a set of legal principles and enactments that everybody then interprets. Over hundreds of years, centuries and centuries, judges were ruling in little cases, whose cow is it? Who has the right to collect firewood from this tree between midsummer and Lent, or whatever it might be. And out of these cases and precedents, a body of law develops over 1,000 years. And it turns out that this customary law, as interpreted by judges, is this incredibly flexible instrument for settling all kinds of ever more complex problems in an ever more complex society. English common law works very much the way Adam Smith's economy works, that through the settling of lots of little disputes, a stately order emerges. Think about English politics. Again, Parliament, the King, the two houses, all of these different elements of the English Constitution. No one plans it. It emerges out of the sort of random, almost jostlings, the fight for power in English history. The Anglican Church, again, nobody would have ever said it was the theological insights and the purity of Henry VIII that brought about the true religion, but out of Henry VIII's divorces, out of English court politics and so on, in the opinion of Anglican divines, God brought the true religion out of these political and even amoral, sometimes, jostlings and competition. Francis Bacon's approach to science, where instead of thinking deductively, what are the grand principles that order life? Rather saying, no, science, and then deducing what happens in individual cases from that. Bacon says, no. The way you do science is you look at lots of little, small, ordinary facts and experiments. And out of these, gradually, you will discover, you don't impose the laws of science, you discover them. All right? All of this is, so Adam Smith's economic theory doesn't come out of nowhere. It expresses a kind of a worldview. I call it the golden meme in the book. Madison's vision of our Constitution, where the different elements of the federal government, the different elements of our society, the ambitions of Congress, the legislature, the president, produce a social order out of these jostlings. Again, this is Adam Smith's economics transposed into a different key. Darwin's theory of evolution works much the same way. Newton's vision of gravity, this Anglo-American vision of an order emerging out of chaos, in a sense, without some intervening social force directing the flow, but by sort of honoring and respecting the inherent emergent order that's out there. This turns out to be a way of thinking about the world that is very, very suited to capitalism. Because capitalism, it's not just about making money, it's about social and technological change. Because in capitalism, if you invent something, you make a lot of money, and you're always trying not simply to do the same thing, but to do it better, faster, cheaper. And the nature of the competition is forcing you to find new ideas and new approaches. So a society in a capitalist system is going to be changing in basic ways from generation to generation. And we've all lived through waves of change here in the United States, and I suspect we have more to come. In much of the world, this kind of change is seen as profoundly unwelcome. In fact, there's a sense in which there's the sacred world of religion and truth and value, which is unchanging and eternal. And social change threatens mankind's rightful place in the universe. And that there is a pattern, a way in which people should live, and changing this is the wrong thing to do, and we don't want to do it. In the Anglo-American world, there has been less of a sense of disconnection as the accelerating forces of modernity and change have upset one apple cart out of the other. We have this confidence that somewhere an invisible hand is working to bring some order out of this. Now, I think theologically this is very much linked to the idea in Anglo-American Protestantism that we're saved by faith as individuals. You're not a Christian, the Puritans and other early Protestants didn't think you were a Christian because your parents were Christian, or you were a member of a Christian nation, or you were baptized as a baby. That doesn't make you a Christian. What makes you a Christian is you make a decision as an adult, or at least as a teenager. You accept Jesus as your Savior, you choose this, and that makes you a Christian. So your identity is not something that comes to you from tradition and the past, it's something you affirm. And the story of God's call to Abraham becomes central in the preaching in England and America. And if you look very carefully at that, this is, God says to Abraham, leave your father and your father's house, your father's gods. Follow me to a new land, and there I will show you the promise. So this sense that in a changing world, by accepting and by dealing with change, we are not abandoning our religious and cultural roots, but actually we affirm them. We are rooted in change. Even for people who are not in themselves religious or orthodox in any way. This vision that you have a life you need to live, a destiny you need to work out that is different from what your parents had, that may involve you moving thousands of miles away, changing professions, changing religions, adopting an entirely different set of values. But you need to do this to be true to that inner call in yourself. Something, and you don't know where it leads. You follow it in hope and in faith. That is something that I think today in American culture, many people who would never go near an evangelical church of any kind have that psychological formation, which is very much rooted in the history of Anglo-American Christianity. So, having said all of that, it's easy to see why we think, that we're winning and our victory is good. The invisible hand is bringing a perfect social order out of struggle and chaos and war. So every time we see that we are winning World War II, World War I, the Cold War, we think, hey, the invisible hand at last is bringing order out of chaos, good out of evil, peace is coming. And it's very natural to our faith and our optimism to see that happening. Well, why are we wrong? Okay? Why are we wrong? Because so far, in case anybody here hasn't noticed, it isn't happening. You know? We keep winning, but the trouble doesn't seem to stop. Well, I think it has to do, the discussion over the development of history these days tends to kind of oscillate between two poles. The pole of Francis Fukuyama and the end of history, which is, triumph of liberal democracy is creating a global social order. You have no choice. You have to get with the program, and this is going to be triumphant everywhere. And with the end of the Cold War, there's no mass basis for effective opposition to it. And then there's Samuel Huntington, who says, no, there are going to be clashes between cultures and civilizations because this liberal democratic system doesn't, in fact, only is a cultural product of one culture, one civilization. And other cultures and civilizations aren't necessarily going to be made happy or made to feel whole by what takes place in this liberal democratic system. Now, this actually is a very, very old debate in Western culture. Fukuyama would be the first to say that his position is sort of the latest iteration of a position that was probably most systematically put forward by Hegel, the German philosopher. Huntington didn't say as much about this, but his position equally reflects the views of another German, an 18th century German named Herder, who talked about how, for Herder, the different cultures of the world were different, not just a little different, not superficially different, but Herder would say, for example, that a language is more than just a way of speaking, it's a worldview. That someone who speaks in German and is raised in a German culture has a different way of understanding and feeling in the world than, say, somebody raised in a French culture does, or an English-speaking culture. And so for somebody like Herder, history isn't one road that we're all following to one destination. History is more like a process. You have a lot of different trees in a forest, and they're all growing up. But the trees don't meet at the top into an uber tree that's all the same. No matter how high you go, a pine tree is a pine tree, and a birch tree is a birch tree, and a palm tree is a palm tree. So there are two different visions of the way history is going. And a lot of the intellectual debate in America, and indeed throughout the world in the last 20 years, has been, well, is it a Fukuyaman world or a Huntingtonian world? Is it a Hegelian world or a Herder-esque world? And by the way, I should point out that there are diseases of both views. Fascism took Herder's vision of cultural destiny and elevated that into a sort of a principle, a first principle. And Nazism is kind of the ultimate perversion of Herder. But in the same way, Marxism-Leninism was a perversion of Hegelian universalism. So both of these trains of thought are capable of being perverted into totalitarian forms, and both of them can also support kind of respect for pluralism and diversity. So I don't think the choice between them is a moral choice, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But it seems to me that both of them are true. And this is a little bit irritating, that we're stuck with both. They had that big debate, is light made of individual particles, or is light a wave like energy? And then, they're sort of annoyingly forced to say, well, actually it's both. It's a wave and it's particles. And in the same way, is history Fukuyaman or is it Huntingtonian? It's both. That is to say, capitalism, liberal capitalism, is in fact an irresistible social system. It spreads by the nature of its own dynamism, and you have to deal with it whether you want to or not. You can love it, you can hate it, you can be good at it, you can be bad at it, but it's there. And your response to it and your ability to respond to it will play a large role in shaping your destiny. So in the 19th century, you have China and Japan. They're both sitting there peacefully minding their own Herderian business, being their own cultures and having their, growing to the sky. And suddenly this force comes in from the outside, Anglo-American and other capitalism coming in, and, they have to respond or they'll be overwhelmed. And the Japanese figured out how to do it in the 19th century. The Chinese didn't. And the consequences for both countries were pretty dramatic. In the 20th century, the Chinese seem to be getting better at it. In the 21st, they're doing pretty well, but who knows what the future holds. But in any case, it's an objective challenge that every society in the world has to deal with. So in this sense, it is a Hegelian or Fukuyaman universal force. And it's universal precisely because in some ways it is stronger, it is more efficient than other ways of organizing human society. And so in competition it tries to win. It tends to win, as the Anglo-Americans have been doing. But at the same time, different cultures aren't disappearing. They're there. They're here. They're here to stay. And when this irresistible universal force impacts your culture, you respond to it in ways that are shaped by your own cultural history, and you continue to be shaped by your own culture. You continue to have the value structures of your own culture, even as you learn to cope. The French, after 300 years, are as French as they ever were. And they're as resentful of the British, by the way, as they ever were, and of the Americans even more, but they've learned to cope. They don't get less French. The tree grows higher, but it remains a pine tree. And I think we'll be seeing this happening around the world. Now, the great problem in terms of politics and policy now is that some cultures seem to have an easier time of making this adjustment than others do. As I say, the Chinese couldn't do it in the 19th century. More lately, they've been successful. I think it's fairly clear that in large parts of the Islamic world, people are not satisfied with the ability of their culture, their governing systems, or what have you, to deal with this intrusion from outside. And it can be a vicious circle because your failure to do well in the capitalist system makes you weaker and less able to shape your future in a world in which this irresistible force keeps moving forward. And so the world becomes less and less the way you think it ought to be as to the degree to which you're unable or are prevented by the power of others from responding. And I'll close really with talking about what I think happens when a culture meets, sort of gets pushed really to the edge. And I want to start with something that happened in, again, you're probably all familiar with this, 1856 in South Africa. A young woman named Nonkwawusa of the Xhosa tribe, goes down to water her cattle one day. And 1856 was a particularly bad year for the Xhosa. The British had been expanding their settlements in South Africa. The Xhosa had just lost yet another war to the damned British. And the British were taking tribal land. Now they were establishing a fort, a garrison in Xhosa territory. It was just unendurable. And Nonkwawusa gets down, and essentially she has a vision. And the gods say to her, "Look, Nonkwawusa, the problem is not with Xhosa culture. Our culture is not inferior to British culture. It's not that our way of doing things is less than the British. In fact, we're greater than them. Your gods are more powerful than their gods. Your ways are better ways than their ways. But what's happened? Nonkwawusa, the Xhosa have not shown sufficient faith. You've compromised. You haven't really truly lived the Xhosa way. So here's what to do. The Xhosa need to kill all their cattle and show their faith in the old gods and the old ways. Kill your cattle. Burn the stored food. Show your faith. And then the The gods will restore all the cattle you've killed. They'll create new, hell, and more and better ones. All the food that was destroyed, they will replace. Furthermore, the British will all sail back to England, best of all. And the Xhosa killed the cattle. 300,000 head of cattle they killed. And about 1/3 of the people died in the ensuing famine. But this idea that at the moment of total crisis, existential crisis for a society, what happens is you get this phenomenon of, if we could just be completely true to who we are, to us, then everything would, these Anglo-Americans would vanish like mist before our faces, before the sun of our true way. This, in fact, I think animated many of the sort of Japanese officers in the waning days of World War II, the kamikazes. Just show your true faith in the emperor. But it was also the Boxer Rebellion in China. It was among the North American Indians, the ghost dance movement in the 1890s. And in many of these movements, by the way, there's the belief that your garments will be blessed in a way that the bullets of the whites will be helpless against you. You'll be invulnerable. The boxers believe this. Some of the ghost dancers believe this. Actually, in 19th century Spain, there was a Carlist rebellion against a liberal government backed by the evil British, and their soldiers believed that if the priests blessed certain scapulars and they wore them into battle, the evil bullets of the infidels wouldn't be able to damage them. Now, obviously, I think you can see some resonances with this, with the ghost dancing movements, some of which we're seeing in the Islamic world today. Ghost dancers today are a little bit more dangerous than they used to be. In the old days, they could kill their own cattle. Now they can try to kill yours, thanks to technology and so on. But I think the phenomenon is rather similar. But there is, I think, an optimistic element in this, which is that generally speaking, when you have these ghost dancing movements, it's a response of a culture in crisis, but ghost dancing is not the predominant response of the culture. The boxers fail and you get Sun Yat-sen and the First Republic in China, and China begins to move, the movement that is still going on, to find a way to be both Chinese and modern and successful. Most of the Indians who were involved in the ghost dancing movement, which wasn't just among the Sioux, it was all over the area, most of them, for them, this was a way, it turned into a way of finding a way to reconcile an agricultural way of life and also to maintain Indian identity, language, culture in a world that was being shaped in very unwelcome ways. In Xhosa history, the most famous name among the Xhosa is not Nonkwawusa, it's Nelson Mandela. So, so you have some people going off in this ghost dancing way, but the forward movement of the culture, of the civilization, of the faith, is in a way of finding a way to be true to itself and yet also to be adequate to this challenge. So I think we Anglo-Americans, again, are wrong to sort of think simplistically that our way is going to work for everybody. On the other hand, we can't just sort of be ourselves and leave everyone else alone, because by being who we are, we impinge on other people. Our society is dynamic, our economic system, it reaches out, it's transformative. It's a fact. This is a fact. So we and everybody else have to get used to this. And it's not going to be easy. And it's why I say toward the end of God and Gold that what we really need to be thinking about as we look into the future is a diplomacy of civilizations. Because I think that's the only way to mediate the kind of inevitable clashes and conflicts that we have within the context of a social system that continues to expand, continues to draw people into its orbit, and continues to pose an inescapable challenge for people all over the world. Well, thank you very much.
So we've distributed some cards, and if you have some questions, they'll get collected. And I'll ask the first question in the meantime, which is, what is the policy implications of your book? Because I think if our policymakers were to read this book, the notion of going to a place and democratizing it overnight is really, on the face of it, ridiculous.
Well, we did it in Germany and Japan, but I'm not sure that we or anybody else would want to go through all of that again. I think it does lend weight to the idea that this is a complex process, and it has to be led from within. That every culture, we cannot impose a way of being modern and capitalist and democratic or any of these things on other people. Other cultures and other societies are going to have to find their own path, and we ought to be thinking more about how do we facilitate that rather than how do we impose. So I think caution might be one of the lessons that would come out of the book. Question here: can you expand on what you mean by the diplomacy of civilization specifically? And in your book, you reflect on the reflections of Reinhold Niebuhr, and you might want to bring that up now. No, I think that's absolutely right. Reinhold Niebuhr, as many of you may know, was probably the leading mainstream Protestant theologian, or Protestant theologian, period, or even theologian, and maybe even the leading thinker that 20th century America produced. And one of the core things that Niebuhr did was he took what had been traditionally the Christian doctrine of original sin and turned this into a sort of a tool of political analysis that people who weren't Christian could use. In fact, Arthur Schlesinger very famously wanted to organize the Society of Atheists for Reinhold Niebuhr. And the idea here is that every individual in the world sort of has a basic problem. That is, we see ourselves as the center of the moral universe. My stubbed toe moves me far more profoundly than I am moved by your broken leg. And that's just the way people are. Now, in our individual lives, we gradually learn, and you can see this at work in any sandbox in America, we gradually learn that we're going to have to modify that theory to get along with other people and find satisfaction in our lives. But Niebuhr notes that our identity isn't just individual, it's collective. I'm not just me. I'm an American, I'm a Christian, I'm an intellectual, I might have many other identities, but we tend to we tend to project ourselves into our identities, and we project our grandiosity and our narcissism and our self-centeredness into these larger identities. And I would be ashamed at this point in my life to say that I, Walter Mead, am the most important thing on earth, but it's a little easier for me to say the United States of America is the greatest country on God's earth, or if I were Russian, to say the Russian Federation is the greatest country on God's earth, or to say my religion, the one true religion, is the most important thing on God's earth. And so that we don't, the collectivities that we are part of, we don't check them and limit the moral claims they make in the way that we do for our individual selves. And so international relations, and especially today sort of cultural and civilizational relations, are full of these collectivities that we haven't in a sense morally qualified or checked. And the over-assertion of a Western or an American identity might meet, on the other hand, the over-assertion of an Islamic or a Pakistani or an Arab identity. And we tend to think, too, that when we are victimized, that's the most important thing, and the whole world should stop until we get justice. So if you're Palestinian, you think until the Palestinians get justice, nothing else should happen in the world. Americans might think until 9/11 is dealt with, nothing else should happen in the world. Your own grievances, your collective grievances, are projected to the absolute sort of quality of moral imperatives. Now, where Niebuhr, I think, was clever and important is that he didn't do what some people do, which is say, okay, well, instead of saying that we're everything, we should say we are nothing. And we should say America's the worst country in the world, or we have no right to defend ourselves, or our system is the most evil in the world. You know, in a sense, sort of just to reverse the polarities. And the other is great, and the other is magnificent. Niebuhr says, no, we are who we are, and we have a right to live, and we have a right to be, but we also need to take note of the other. And yes, we will sometimes have to check, oppose, and even fight the other. Niebuhr said in the Cold War that the use of nuclear weapons could, under certain circumstances, be legitimate in a just war. So Niebuhr was not a kind of a pacifistic thinker by any means. He's a very tough one. But he believed that we should check and qualify our own moral assertions. And it seems to me that that idea is a very important piece of what a diplomacy of civilizations would need to look. That's where American culture and thought can find some support as we look for a way to engage more diplomatically with other cultures and civilizations.
There are several questions that asked you to look at kind of the dark side of this triumphant system. One question here, Paul Kennedy and Kevin Phillips see empires, Spain, Netherlands, UK, collapsing rather quickly from wars of their own choosing. Does the U.S. not run this risk? And then another question here asks about, you know, the dark side involving genocidal cost. Continent spanning landed empires, you know, that were built on slavery and forced labor. How do these problems undermine the notion of winning?
Well, again, let me sort of deal with that question. This is not a book about moral triumph. All right. When I use the word win, I tend to mean it in a sort of a realist sense. This is the same use I had of it in Special Providence. That, you know, we win the wars. That doesn't mean that an impartial heavenly referee would say we fought them more nobly than the other side. Or that our triumph was always and everywhere better than the alternative. But it is, and this I do bring out in the book, for all the awful things that have been done by the Anglo-Americans over the last 3 centuries. You know, in continental Europe, they used to always point at the British, what they were doing in Ireland. Obviously the Indian slavery. It's a long list. But it's interesting. After the Anglo-Americans defeated, say, the absolute Catholic empire of Louis XIV and Louis XV, nobody has wanted really a restoration of Catholic absolutism. You know? Nobody wanted a restoration of the Jacobins, or very few people did. Nobody wants to return to Imperial Germany, much less to Nazi Germany. Nobody wants the Soviets back. So, in a sense, regardless of what one thinks of the Anglo-American record, and you could write you write a library full of crimes, errors, follies, everything else you want to say, and people have been doing it. I mean, you know, these sections of the libraries are not vacant. You nevertheless do have to see, I think, over time that there isn't a lot of nostalgia for the people that the Anglo-Americans defeated. My guess would be, by the way, that when the last terrorist lays down the last suicide bomb in the Middle East, and when the last sort of jihadi takfiring radicals are gone, there won't be a lot of nostalgia for that either. So, you know, it's not something, and again, Reinhold Niebuhr talks about this as well, it's not a question of absolute good versus absolute evil, but the question is there just enough liberty, just enough progress in what's gone on that I won't say justifies the suffering, because some of the suffering that takes place and has taken place, nothing can justify suffering. But that means that on the whole, where we are is a base for the world to move forward.
And what about this question about capitalism being brought down by its wars and their costs?
Right. Well, Marx had that theory. And it was the Soviet Union that was brought down by the costs of confrontation, not capitalism. I'm young enough, or old enough, I should say, to remember when in Berkeley everybody used to talk about late capitalism. Because we were now obviously in the era of late capitalism when the fall was imminent. Well, it seems to be at worst early middle capitalism or even late middle capitalism. I guess what I'd say is Paul Kennedy is an interesting case in point of somebody who's come to take a much stronger view of the resilience of American power. In fact, I'm very happy to say he's blurbed this book. Not in time for the American edition, tragically, but the British edition will bear his blurb. And I think here we have made almost every possible error if you look at American foreign policy over the last 2 centuries. Now we're sort of back more in special providence territory than in God and gold territory. But we've gotten almost everything wrong at one time or another. We've intervened when we shouldn't have intervened. We've stayed out when we shouldn't have stayed out. We've done the right thing in the wrong way. We've done the wrong thing in the right way. We've done the wrong thing in the wrong way. And yet somehow we seem to be winning, not because we're smarter than other people, which we're certainly not, but again, it's sort of the dynamism of American society, combined, I think, with, again, this geopolitical role as a balance of power player. So when America was defeated in the Vietnam War, what happened was everybody in Asia suddenly got worried that America would leave. When the weaker we looked in Asia, the more people wanted us to stay. The same way, by the way, in the Middle East today, that as America got, there were a lot of people who thought, oh my God, one of the things that's going to happen with this war in Iraq is that we won't have any more Arab allies. And the Arab, what seems to be happening though is as the Americans got into a deeper hole in Iraq, people like the Saudis and other Sunni Arabs began to worry, oh my goodness, if the Americans leave too quickly or in the wrong way, the Iranians will dominate. And so you see them tilting toward the Americans against because the distant power is never going to be as big a threat as the ugly big neighbor. So as a balancing power, there's a sense that if we suffer a setback, other people are sort of trying to prop us up a little bit. And this was true for Britain before it was true for us. It's not how smart we are in some ways, it's how well we fit.
I'll make this the last question, and I'll build on a question that's here from the audience. We are going to have a book signing after here. And the person asks, how is your argument for the rise of Anglo-American dominance and the psychological sequence between Protestantism different from Max Weber's Protestant ethic thesis? And in your book, I think you go into a great deal of the way religion interacted with capitalism and a synergy developed that, in other words, gave us a mission in the world, basically. It's our version of the Abrahamic narrative. So talk a little about that. Tell us a little more about this connection between religion and capitalism.
Okay. Well, to start on the Weber front, I think that I generally do accept a lot of Weber's analysis in the book with some qualifications. But I also note that in Weber, the Calvinist is capitalist because, in a sense, he's running from hell. He's, the hope is that if you're succeeding in your business and you're working hard, this is a sign that God is at work in your life and you're not going to be condemned to hell. In my vision of this more Abrahamic thing, it's attraction that's pulling people toward capitalism. That a guy like Henry Ford or John D. Rockefeller, or for that matter Bill Gates, is not running in fear from hell. They're running sort of entranced toward a vision of a better world, a more transcendent. In some ways, religious values and business values get mixed in a positive sense. So they're like Abraham following God's call into a new world. I make the comparison actually to Don Quixote. You know, if you've read Don Quixote, you know that he was tilting at windmills. He was, you know, sort of attacking a windmill under the belief that he was saving a beautiful damsel from an evil giant. So that, you know, what happens here that his own imagination sprinkled fairy dust over the prospect before him. And so he saw himself as an actor in this great thing, even though an onlooker might consider him kind of a bit of an idiot. And in the same way, the Anglo-American business person or capitalist sees themselves as an actor in this great drama of humanity transcending its limits through developments in technology. You know, if you go to Silicon Valley, they'll tell you about the singularity, and maybe we're going to live forever, and the information revolution is going to change the human condition. So yes, I'm making money, but really what I'm doing as a Silicon Valley entrepreneur, or as Rockefeller in his time, is I am making the world a fundamentally better and different place. If you're religious, you'd say, I'm bringing about the kingdom of God on earth. And the different, you know, you could argue that Rockefeller was an idiot and what he was doing was actually creating a horrible monopoly and stifling competition. And you can say that Don Quixote was a fool. True. But the subjective experience of both people is that they're kind of noble knights on a great, I don't want to use the word crusade somehow. I think that's not good diplomacy of civilizations. So maybe I'll say it's a jihad, a struggle for righteousness. But in their own subjectivity, you know, it was positive. And furthermore, then at the end of the day, the Rockefeller, the Gates, change the world and create power in a way that Quixote's set of illusions and beliefs don't. So it's a mesh of a subjective psychology with the objective consequences of that in the world.
Before I thank our guest, and in this session, I want to point out that the Institute of Governmental Studies and the Institute of International Relations are sponsoring a series of panels and lectures, and I just want to tell you about some of the lectures that are coming up. On November 5th, Edward Luttwak is going to be here to talk about strategic options for the United States, and that'll be in this room at 4 o'clock on Monday, November 5th. And then another lecture in the series is on November 16th. Amy Chua of the Yale Law School, professor of law at the Yale Law School, will be talking about her book, and we'll have a book signing, The Moment of Empire, How Diversity Contributes to the Rise and Fall of Empires. That's Friday, November 16th at noon in 145 Dwinell. And then finally, I want to mention that on November 26th, in this room at 4 o'clock, Steve Biddle from the Council of Foreign Relations, who will be coming from a trip in Iraq where he's an advisor to the command there and to General Petraeus, will be giving a status report on the situation in Iraq. That's November 26th at 4 o'clock in this room. So we want to take now the moment to thank Walter Russell Mead for writing this book, because it is a great book, which even he can't cover in an hour. And thank you again for being here today. And thank you.